Premonstratensian order of canons. Now, these were not strictly monks; they were canons, so they were actually ordained priests who would rather than live a contemplative life within the abbey, they would actually go out and provide spiritual services within their immediate area. So, for example, we know that the canons of Tongland provided the services at Sennick Church, and even as far away as Minigaff near Newton Stewart. So this was an order, the Premonstratensian order, which actually went out and worked in the community, if you like, but at the same time lived under a monastic rule within their abbey at Tongland. So we know it was founded in 1218. We know that the canons came up from Cockersand Abbey near Lancaster. But what we don't know exactly is where was it, or how big was it, or what was its layout. So these are really the questions that we've been trying to answer since we started this project back in 2015. It's thought, if you go down to Tongland Church, the two churches and the graveyard, you'll see the ruin of the older church, 1633. And it's thought that the part of the north wall is actually a remnant of one of the abbey walls. We don't know, what part of the abbey, but the wall indicated there on the right-hand side in the right-hand picture, on the left side on the left-hand picture, is the only standing remnant of the monastic of the abbey wall that we know about. Now, looking at the right-hand image and the doorway there, to the left of the doorway, there's another part of the north wall. And next slide, please, Helen. Yeah. Now, on that wall, which we don't think is medieval, but nevertheless within the wall, there is a medieval heraldic panel. I've circled it on the left within the red circle, and it's got a yellow pointer. And on the right, you can see a detail photograph of it. It shows a shield with a diagonal line through it, what's called a bend in heraldic terms. And on the bend are 3 acorns. And these are the arms of the Muirhead or Moorhead family, who in fact were tenants of Billy's and Mayfield farms, or the land that now comprises those 2 farms, across the River Dee from the abbey and slightly upstream. So they were major, well, sort of minor landowning or land renting figures in Scottish history. The family fought at the Battle of Flodden and lost a good many of the clan and the clan leader at that battle, as did so many Scottish noble and aristocratic families. So the stone is there probably because the family were patrons in some way of the abbey in the 15th century, and we'll come back to them a bit later. Next slide, please, Helen. Just taking a helicopter view now of the general area, just to let's establish where we are exactly. Tongland, well, many of us know this, but it's just to the north of Kirkcudbright, and significantly, it's just north of the point where the River Dee ceases to become navigable by reasonably sized sailing vessels. You can get as far as the present-day Tongland Bridge, but you can't really get much further than that because of the rocky dokes of Tongland, which prevent shipping go much further north than the abbey, the point of the abbey itself. Next slide, please, Helen. And this is an aerial view of the general site. So you can see the present-day Clachan, the village of Tongland, on the left. And on the right of the picture, you can see the dark line is the River Dee. And then I've drawn a circle around the ruins of the two churches. In the middle of the circle, you can see a yellow pointer, which is indicating the older parish church, which we saw at the very beginning. And then we can see the rectangular ruin of the 1813 Victorian or Georgian second parish church. And of course, you can see the churchyard quite clearly round about that. And then roughly to the south, in the southern half of the red circle, we have the garden and the trees of the former church manse wood. And we've got a bit, if we go back a bit. Thanks, Helen. And somewhere in this red circle must be or we think must be the Abbey and all its associated buildings. So what clues have we got? Well, if we don't have a lot of written or recorded evidence, it's very patchy. We have no paintings, no Victorian paintings of ruined buildings or even drawings or sketches. All we have is, on the next slide, please, Helen. All we have is a section of a plan drawn by John Galone, the well-known map maker and surveyor in the late 18th century in Kirkcudbright. This is a plan dated to 1794, and it's really, the purpose of the plan was really to illustrate what was going on down at the river, the salmon fishery. But in fact, very kindly, very luckily for us, John Galone also drew in the parish church at that time, which was not a ruin then. It was still in use and had its roof on, as you can see from that little sketch. And that's indicated by the top yellow arrow. And then the bottom yellow arrow shows his sketch of what he calls the ruins of the priory. And it is literally, as you can see, I hope, a pile of rubble, a pile of stone. It's not so much a ruin as a heap of demolition material. But perhaps significantly, he locates his pile of rubble sort of halfway between the church, the 1613 church, and the river. So you might say roughly where the 1813, the rectangular ruin that we saw in the aerial view, is located. So we've got a clue, gives us a clue where certainly some ruins or some source of this building debris must be located. Next slide, please, Helen. And then the Abbey's certainly been written about over the years. The first reference we have is Andrew Simpson's Greater Description of Galloway of 1684, when he was able to write at that time that the steeple, is the main tower and steeple of the Abbey, and part of the walls are yet standing, which seems to imply that there was really quite a lot to see, particularly if the steeple was still up. 100 years later, in the old statistical account for the parish of Tongland, we're told that the Abbey's north wall is the parish church's north wall is part of the priory, now in ruins. And that's pretty much the situation we have today, isn't it? We've pointed out the north wall of the parish church, and that's where this information comes from about the north wall, from this source. But what particularly important is the second statement, that contiguous to the church are the ruins of the priory or the abbey. And that means that there must have been visible signs of more ruins around the church. And then about 30 years later, 1824, in Chalmers, Caledonia, the comment is that the house, the abbey, had been of considerable extent, but the country people, having undermined the building for freestone, the whole fell into ruins. So this explains why there's really nothing left today. that the abbey was obviously a derelict site, and the stone was used and essentially quarried from the abbey buildings for reuse elsewhere. And we know, for example, that material went to the building of the mills down on the river, the various mill buildings down there. It went into the building of the old Tongland Bridge, and it went. You can see it bits and pieces in some of the buildings within the Tongland Clachan. There's quite a lot that Donald Henry, for example, has found in his property at Tongland Hall, and there's architectural stones, work stones, for example, in the Manswood house itself. So we've got a clue from these writings that there is a bigger site, and around about it was quite an extensive site, and we've got an important clue that contiguous to the church, adjacent to the church, more ruins can be found. Next slide, please, Helen. If I could just put the abbey in its medieval context, it's one of several monastic houses that we have in Galloway. We tend to think, when we talk about monastic sites in southern Scotland, perhaps we tend to think of the Devereux and the Melroses over in the borders, and certainly a really important cluster of generally well-preserved ruinous sites, ruinous abbeys in that area. But this little distribution map shows the plot of monastic sites in Galloway as well. And the red-starred sites are the pre-Menstratensian houses. So you can see Tongland there. And then Whithorn on the peninsula is there, also pre-Menstratensian. And Solseat at Stranraer, the same. And across on the Nith Valley there, just to the north of Dumfries, you've got Connell or Hollywood Abbey, which is also pre-Menstratensian. And between the pre-Menstratensians and the Cistercians, these two orders really are make up the orders, taking space, occupying most of the abbey sites, monastic sites in our region in Galloway. So, for example, with the Cistercian sites, of course, we have Dundrennan nearby, but we also have Glenluce, which we'll be looking at quite a bit later, and New Abbey, founded from Dundrennan, the old abbey, hence the time New Abbey or Sweetheart. And then I put in Cockersan, which is obviously off the map to the south by Lancaster. You might think that's a long way away, but not really, because if you were travelling by boat, by sea, as almost certainly they were in the 13th century when they came from Cockersan to Tongland, it was relatively you could make the journey, I think, within 24 to 48 hours, depending on the winds. Next slide, please, Helen. Right, Glenluce I mentioned, and we think that probably Tongland was a small to medium-sized abbey, not unlike the size of Glenluce we can see here. We're looking across to the ruins there. The church is in the foreground, and there's not really much left of that, but there is a bit more left of the buildings around the cloister at Glenluce. Dundrennan would be a much bigger site than either Glenluce or Tongland, as would Sweetheart. But this is probably what Tongland might have looked like when Simpson was writing back in 1684. That first reference we had. Next slide, Helen. And the other useful thing about Glenluce is that not only is it similar size, but actually it's quite a classic layout for an abbey. Abbeys tend to follow a similar plan across the UK, across Europe, where you essentially have the abbey church on the north side of the cloister square or the cloister garth, and it's around the cloister where that the living accommodation, the eating and kitchen facilities are for the monks or canons, and Glenluce is fairly typical of that. So that you see the cloister in the middle there. Well, to the right of the cloister, the east range, we have the larger square building that's got the red line for the cloister running across it. That's the chapter house. And then on the south side, indicated by the yellow arrow, we've got the kitchen and the refectory area there. And on the west side of the cloister, we've got what were probably used as laypersons or laymen's accommodation and storage facilities for the abbey. And notice there's a little porch there as well. Next slide, Helen, thank you. So that's a general background, but how did this project begin? Well, it's all down to, I would say, Tongland and Ringford Community Council, but particularly Donald Henry. And it begins in 1215 because in that year, that year marked the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta, so a very important national event. And funding was available for local projects to celebrate the Magna Carta year. And you might think, well, what's that got to do with Scotland? That's way down in South Runnymede in Surrey, King John and all that and his barons. What's it to do with Scotland? It's to do with Scotland in that there are two Scots mentioned on the Magna Carta. One was the King Alexander II, and the other was the King's Constable or Commander-in-Chief, commander of his armies, and that was Alan, Lord of Galloway. So we have this connection with linking Magna Carta with Tongland Abbey through Alan, Lord of Galloway. 1215, he's mentioned on the Magna Carta, and in 1218, 3 years later, he's founding the abbey. So the Community Council successfully applied for funds to celebrate the fact that there was this connection through Alan, Lord of Galloway. And some of the funding was spent on an information panel, which is still there in the parish churchyard. And this is the unveiling of it. Sandy McCulloch, Deputy Lord Lieutenant, unveiling. And if next slide, please, Helen. And the panel carries a lot of information that we know about Alan, Lord of Galloway, and the foundation of the Abbey and his link with the Magna Carta. But central to it is this reconstruction, artist reconstruction, really, of the Abbey as it might have been drawn by John Pickham. And this is very largely based on the layout of Glenluce. So you can see there the Abbey Church with its tall steeple, and then the cloister with its range of buildings around it, and the river on the right, River Dee on the right. And it's also shown with a wall going around the whole Abbey complex and a gatehouse, because we know that in the 15th century, the whole site was enclosed by a precinct wall, sort of thing which you can still see around Sweetheart Abbey to this present day. But it was in the 15th century that, about 1420, I think, that Tongland got its wall as well. Next slide, please, Helen. The Magna Carta funds also allowed us to commission a geophysical survey of the garden of Manswood, the lawn area, grass area of Manswood. It's very difficult to do a geophysics within a churchyard because there's so much ground disturbance. But within the open lawn area, we hoped that it might be possible to pick up some evidence for wall foundations by geophysics, and that we might see a buried picture and an outline and a plan of some of the Abbey buildings appearing once we've done this geophysical survey. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way, and the only clear evidence of buried structures was at the very bottom part of the, which thank you, Alan, for circling that, where we have quite a clear signal there for a linear feature, which looks like a wall foundation. We did excavate that later, and in fact, it's not a wall foundation, but it is a foundation for a road of some sort, about 2.5 meters wide. So a very narrow road, but definitely a road surface, which seems possibly to, if you continue that northwards, there's a sort of smudgy outline which seems to veer off to the left, and may join the existing or the present day road leading into to Mansfield House itself. But for the rest of it, it's blotchy, but clearly no clear evidence of buried wall foundations coming through there. Next slide, please, Alan. Consequently, in the following year, 2016, we managed to gather some funding to begin a program of trial excavations, initially quite small trenches, just to see if we could pick up anything by excavation, particularly around the old parish church, where we had that clue from the 1790s that there had been visible, over 200 years ago, evidence of other buildings around the parish church. So with a bit of luck, we thought, well, we might be able to pick up some of those and be able to begin to reconstruct part of the plan of the site from that. Now we obviously can't dig in the churchyard. That's prohibited. But Suzanne Powell, who was then the owner of Mansfield, very kindly allowed us to dig within her garden. And as I say, we were hoping to find foundations of walls which would be sufficient to allow us to begin to generate part of the plan of the Abbey site. And as we've seen, Abbeys tend to follow a common plan. So the hope was that, right, if we can find enough of the plan, if you like, a big enough jigsaw piece, we might be able to fit that against a typical monastic abbey layout, and from that extrapolate the rest of the layout from the evidence that we'd actually excavated. That was the hope, anyway. So the following slides, and Helen, if you'd like to go through these at sort of a steady pace, indicate the nature of the ground we were excavating and some of the finds we made of the walls. So here we have, in this trench and in the previous one, we can see a typical cross-section of the northern part of the site, really. And we soon discovered that much of the northern part of the site was actually made up ground, in that there must have been a large hollow at the north end of the Mansfield garden, because it's got filled up with redeposited subsoil, which you can see indicated in the sort of far section. And this had covered a buried topsoil, that grey soil we saw. And then underneath, as I say, we found this across the north end of the site, which has required us to hire a mechanical excavator to get rid of this modern material, really. It probably dates to the mid-20th century. And once you take that off, you get down to the buried topsoil, and within 6 to 12 inches under that, you start finding foundations. So this was a great day when we first came across these wall foundations you can see here, which seem to be part of a porch or an entry into the cloister yard on the west side of the abbey. Next slide, Helen. And well, once we'd found one piece of the one length of wall, we were able to follow walls here, there, and everywhere, really. And these walls are really quite substantial. This is a long north-south wall, and look at those huge pieces of porphyroite which are put into the foundations. This is almost certainly porphyroite. This is an igneous rock which is quarried, or until recently was quarried in Tongland Quarry, which it produces the red chips you get for your garden. Difficult to shape, so it's not so good for freestone, for facing stone, but it's very good, massive stuff for foundations. And so we're looking at the combination of the grey wacky, the grey stone, and this porphyroite, all bonded together by a shell mortar. And this is a substantial wall, potentially with enough load-bearing capacity to imply a two-story building. Next slide, please, Helen. And here it is again from a different angle, and you can see also Vivian in the far distance, and Sheila working in this particular trench. And that wall is running, that same wall we looked in the last slide is now running down towards us, up to where the ladder is resting against the side of the trench. And just beyond it, the corner of the wall of that building is indicated by the yellow arrow. And just to the south of that large, substantial building with its broad foundations, we came across a water channel, which you can see that's got the range rod in it. So this is probably carrying the water supply into the Abbey area, into the Abbey kitchens particularly. And then after the Abbey kitchen, it runs through to the latrines and serves to flush out the monastic latrines. Next slide, please, Helen. And at the far end of this particular building, we didn't find the wall, but we did find that the wall had been heavily robbed, so that most of the stone had been taken out even at foundation level. Just a couple of large blocks left there, you can see in the bottom of the trench. But look at to the left of those large blocks, you can see red staining on in the bottom of the trench. These are fragments of red sandstone flooring. And in places, it's got a touch of a sort of mortar or plaster skim, a white mortar skim. So here we had an indication of the floor surface of that particular building. And if you look at the far section where the vertical rod is leaning, you can see again that the top end of the top half of the section side of the trench is made up of this redeposited natural subsoil or till. And then below that, you get a darker band, which is the former ground surface. And then within a foot of that, you're getting the top of the remnant of the wall. Yeah, thank you, Helen. So come the end of the, well, really to the end of this year's, to the end of last year's work, these were the results after 5 seasons of excavation. And essentially what we have is the old parish church, you can see, is at the top of the picture of the plan. And then we had a long north-south wall running down south into the garden area. Then we had this room, building A, you can see there, which may be a kitchen perhaps, or a refectory. And the robbed out part of that is indicated by the upper yellow arrow. And the corner point where we saw Vivian and Sheila working is indicated by the lower arrow. So that was the corner there. And so below that arrow, you can see in blue, you can see the line of the water channel. And then we found this year, we seem to have another building, rather unexpectedly, we seem to have another building B, which is continuing further south into the garden area. Next slide, please. So just this is the update really of part of the talk. And I'm just going to run through, again, a series of slides showing the excavations. Here we have John. If we could just go back once, Helen, sorry. Yeah, here's John actually cleaning off of the top of the soil off the top of the foundation. He's really squatting there on the mortar surface on top of the foundation wall. And again, you can see in the section the dark band of the buried topsoil covered by an increasingly thick depth of redeposited natural subsoil, which is filling the former hollow, which must have been a feature of the garden till about perhaps the 1920s, 1930s. Very unstable, as you can see, difficult to dig in, and composed as it is of rock and fairly loose soil. Next slide, Helen. Yeah, and now we're looking in the other direction. So John was working down at the near us in the foreground, but we were able to trace that long north-south wall. Again, massive construction, large pieces of porphyry, and then beyond this wall, quite a lot of stonework at the far end of the trench, and we'll see that in the next slide. Yep. So we're looking back to where we were, and I think that's Jenny working at the far end of the trench there, and in the foreground we can see quite what looks like a mass of rubble, really, but it's a combination of demolition rubble and also wall foundation. Next slide, please, Helen. And that's it cleared off, looking a little bit clearer, and you can see, yeah, that's again a fairly broad wall of the second and rather unexpected building B, we're calling it. It's on roughly the same alignment as the first building, so the two would have been, the two might almost have been joined at a higher level and looked as like one long terrace, but there is a difference. This wall is not mortared. It's got no shell mortar. It's not quite so well built, but that could mean that there's a time difference between them. But on the other hand, it could mean that it didn't need to be quite as well built as the first one, or that the money had run out, or that they didn't have much. The budget was reducing. Next slide, Helen. And that's the same new wall of this building B again, and we've got. You can see where the yellow arrow marks the water channel coming right through the site. That's running really from the west to the east towards the river. It was covered by a slab of a horizontal flat slab of greywacke or whinstone. That's at A. B, you can see the corner stone of that building, this new building, and C is a cut through, a later cut through of the wall foundation. Next slide, Helen. And really, this is a summary of the plan that we have revealed in last year's work, 2020, and the 4 trenches outlined in yellow there. And so it's really confirmed the existence of that building A. We've got the 4 sides of that now, and we've got part of building B, and we've got the water channel running from west to east. And to the in trench 25, trench 26, perhaps we'll see these in the next slide, please, Helen. Yeah. So this is the trenches away from those main buildings, building A and B. We've got the water channel running through, not on a straight line. It takes a funny little deviation. That's marked by A, that you can see, and it was actually covered originally by a cobble surface, indicated by B on the photo, and in one place in situ we had one of these channel covers, one of these slabs again, still in position at C, and it looks as if the cobble surface has been at some time robbed. Possibly to remove these quite handy slabs of whinstone or greywacke, leaving just one in position. And we can, but at the far end of the trench, you can see that that channel is continuing sort of underground under the cobble surface and beyond out of the trench. So that's a detail of it there. Yeah, and next slide, Alan. So there we are, just to go back to the plan, we were looking at the water channel running under the cobble surface, heading westwards. And that area of cobbling was bounded by a fragment of walling there within trench 26, 25, which is partly robbed out. It wasn't as wide or as well made as the main building walls, and it seems to have been a little, perhaps a dike wall, which was running to meet the corner of building A, that corner where we saw the ladder resting in the trench where Sheila and Vivian were working. To the north of that wall, there was just a considerable depth of topsoil, really, and I suspect that that wall was serving to retain or define the cobbled area and distinguish it from the perhaps what was a garden area in that part of the building. Very few finds. There was just one 15th century Scottish coin, but otherwise very little finds, but quite a considerable depth of topsoil and perhaps indicating a garden area. Next slide, Helen. So after 5 years' work now of excavating, we have quite a large chunk of the layout. So we have quite a big jigsaw puzzle piece now. This was the plan up to, well, just to the beginning of our work last year in May 2020. So we can, looking at the bottom part of the plan, we can extend that room. That's our building A, kitchen perhaps, and then we've got we know we've got another building to the south of that too. So this is our jigsaw piece. How does it fit? How might it fit, for example, with Glenluce Abbey? Let's look at that, Helen. Well, I've got our jigsaw piece on the left, and there's the plan of Glenluce. What can we see that's similar? Well, the blue arrow points out that little porch area that we found at Tongland, and oh look, at Glenluce we have a similar little porch, which seems to lead into the west range of Glenluce, a sort of side entrance into the abbey, not the main west door of the abbey church, but a way into the cloister area through that little structure. So we've got that at Tongland, but at Tongland we don't seem to have a west range. We don't seem to have that west range which would have provided storage and laypersons accommodation at Glenluce. We just seem to have a west wall, although to the south of that we do have the kitchen area, a bit like Glenluce, that kitchen north-south kitchen block or refectory block indicated by the yellow arrow. So we've got sort of a similarity there. Next slide, Helen. And let's also compare our jigsaw puzzle piece with Devereux, which, remember, is the same order as Tongland, Premonstratensian. Next slide, Helen. And here we have, again, Tongland plan, partial plan on the left, and with the Devereux plan on the right. Okay, at Devereux, well, we don't have a little porch as we did at Glenluce. At Devereux, we do, but interestingly at Devereux, we don't really have a west range. There were some later 16th century structures tacked onto the west wall. You can see the left-hand side of the cloister of as we look at it at Devereux. But essentially there wasn't really a west range in the original plan. There was just a west wall. So there's something which is similar to Tongland. But Devereux doesn't have a kitchen or a refectory area extending southwards from the south side of the cloister, That may be because there's a massive water course running past that, through that area. It does have a, if you look at the east range there on the right-hand side, it does have actually rooms going on beyond the cloister, a bit like what we seem to be having at Tongland as well. But it's interesting that these two houses occupied by the same order don't have west ranges. For some reason, they didn't need lay accommodation, or they had plenty of storage elsewhere in the abbey. So I'm concluding that I think what we found at Tongland is the west side of the cloister and the west end of the south range of the cloister. Next slide, please, Helen. Well, just staying at Devereux, we've got, that's the west wall at Devereux, across the cloister garth, and we're looking at this south range on the left-hand side. Next slide, Helen. So if we're right about what we've found, and if we're right about where we think we are in the monastic plan, the layout of the abbey, and if we extrapolate from what we certainly have found to what we think, well, where we think everything else of the abbey plan should be, that would put the abbey church really within the churchyard. Yeah, and that would include part of the parish church wall that we saw. That would fit nicely. It would mean the east end of the church would be roughly under the present 1813 ruin. But the cloister area and the monks' living accommodation, etc., would be in the north and central part of Mansfield Garden. And you can see I've got the red plan. Shows the position perhaps this time last year, but I've extended that with a yellow rectangle to show these two new buildings A and B, coming down into the garden area in yellow there. Notice also over on the left of the aerial view, we've got an interesting place named Mickle Yet. Next slide, Helen. Mickle Yet probably means main gate or big gate, something like that, principal gate. And I think it actually refers, or this is what my hypothesis anyway, that it's referring to the main gate into the abbey precinct. It's the main approach to the abbey at this time in the 13th, 14th, 15th century is from the west. And when the precinct wall was built and the abbey gate was built in the 15th century, you get an approach very similar to the abbey from the west as you do at Lanercost Priory near Brampton in Cumbria. Next slide, Helen. So if you go to Brampton, they don't call it the Mickle Yet there, but they call it the main gate, the main precinct gate. And imagine this at Tongland. So up in the Clachan part of Tongland now, you would approach the abbey, and you would come to the gate, and through the abbey gate you would see the west wall of Tongland, just as you do at Brampton. You can see the west door of the Lanercost Priory through the gate there. You can see still surviving at Lanercost near Brampton. Next slide, Helen. So just to summarize then, we're coming to I think that what we have, we've been working in this area, the red ringed area of the of Tongland Abbey. We now know that the buildings that we're showing there are not quite accurate. For one thing, you can do away with that long west range of buildings. We didn't have that. We just had a west walls at Devereux. But we did have something similar to those, the north-south running buildings in the bottom half of the red circle, if you like, which were probably the refectory and the kitchen areas. That's what we're thinking at the moment, anyway. So I think we've come quite a long way in 5 years. We've been able to come up with a fairly good hypothesis, a fairly strong hypothesis as to the layout of the Abbey generally. And I think I'd like to finish now with mentioning one or two interesting finds that we've found. Next slide, please, Helen. Yeah, this find was made in 2019, but it was really only over the winter of 1920, so this time last year, that I realised what it was. And what it is actually a fragment of a monumental armoured effigy. And what we're looking at is a carved forearm, really. If you go back one slide, please, Helen. Yep, you can see there's 3 little dots or dimples at the far end of the of this piece of stone. That's actually a carving of a hinge, an armor hinge, and there's also 3 sort of central dimples. You can see 4 rivets as well, and then coming down you've got a fragment of a circular elbow guard. Next slide, Helen. And that has come from this part of a monumental effigy. This is in a similar example, Dunkeld Cathedral. It's the Earl of Buchan, Alexander Earl of Buchan. And you can see that he's got, I've circled what's called the vambrace, in other words, the forearm armour with its hinges. And he's also got a rather elaborate, almost a floral looking like elbow guard as well. So I think our fragment has come from a full-size monumental effigy, which would have been a key, really a major attraction, feature within the Abbey Church. And it just goes to show you of the status of the churches. This wasn't some sort of small small place. This had some serious, expensive monumental effigies in it, at least one anyway. The question is, who might have been the figure commemorated? Can't say really. It could, if you think of who were the major landowning families or landed families in the area in the 14th and 15th centuries, where there's the Douglas family at Thrieve, that's a possibility. Or it could be going back to our Muirheads or Moorhead family, who we know already patronised the Abbey in some way, because we have examples of their heraldic panel here and there in the Abbey. Next slide, please, Helen. And this year, we in that long trench 24, where we're looking at the walls, the channel and the north-south walls of building A and B, sticking out from the section in this trench, we had what we for many weeks called the legs, because this fine spot was actually close to where we found the vambrace fragment, and for a little while I thought, could this be a bit more of the effigy? Next slide, Helen. It wasn't, but almost is of much interest was the fact that this is actually an architectural fragment comprising 2 joined circular columns or pillars. And next slide, please. And if you go back to Glenluce Abbey, you'll see something very similar supporting the cloister walk around the cloister garth. Not quite the same form as the ones we have, but here you can see the partly reconstructed cloister walk in front of in the east range, and that's the chapter house door behind behind it there. So again, it's fascinating that we've got a fragment of the cloister arcade, and we can imagine that Tongland had something like this as well. Maybe not where we found those, where we found that particular piece of masonry, but certainly something like this would have been on the site. Again, it gives you an idea of the the quality and status of the site. Next slide, Helen. So this is the current position in 2020, and we're hoping to carry out a further season of trial excavations this from April this year, and we want to explore the building B, which we can see in the bottom of the plan there. So we would like to see the full extent of that and see if that's it, if that is it for the Abbey, or whether there's even further buildings going on further south. But I doubt it somehow. I think that would be it. But I've been wrong before, so we'll see. So that's the plan, and I should say that we're very grateful to the previous owner of the site, Mrs. Suzanne Powell, for permission to excavate, and equally grateful now to Mr. and Mrs. Robertson, the new owners of Mountswood, who have kindly agreed to allow the excavations to continue for another year. Next slide, please, Helen. So finally, I'd just like to thank all the volunteer diggers who've worked on the site over the years, and particularly the dedicated team from last year, Jennifer, Sheila, Vivian, John, Paul, and Roger. And so we look forward to another successful season this year. And I should mention also, of course, that although we all work, we're all volunteers, but we do need funding for the excavation, particularly for hiring the mechanical digger and consumables. And for the last few years, we've had continuous support from the Hunter Trust, the Hunter Archaeological and Historical Trust based in Falkirk, which have very generously provided that support as well. And finally, may I thank Donald Henry and Tongland and Ringford Community Council for initiating this project and maintaining a very strong interest in it for the last 6 years. So thank you very much, and I hope that's been a interesting update for you all. Thank you.